Hello, everybody. This is the third of four webinars we're doing this week in anticipation of the conference coming up on June the 2nd. And it's a very exciting time to see so much interest in the link between animal abuse and human violence in Portugal. We had an extremely successful conference last year. We're anticipating this year's conference will be even bigger. And I really appreciate the support of the national organizations that have been involved with coordinating all this work. Today, we're going to focus on how the link between animal abuse and domestic violence and child abuse and elder abuse particularly affect prosecutors and judges. We did a webinar on Monday for law enforcement officers, one on Wednesday for veterinarians. There will be one next Monday about domestic violence. But today I'll focus on the impact for judges and prosecutors. As Laurentina mentioned, I head this group in the United States called the National Link Coalition. And the link refers to the fact that there are four areas of family violence which traditionally have been kept in isolation from each other. They've worked in silos. They haven't thought that they're connected. And what the link does, it connects those dots. And it shows that these four forms of family violence really overlap. They really are linked. And by pooling our resources, by working together, and by getting prosecutors and judges to recognize that any one form of family violence often affects other forms as well, we can all do a much better job of protecting families and the animals in those families as well. We have tremendous resources on our website at nationallinkcoalition.org, and I will be giving you some other resources here at the end of the program as well. There's our email address. Please feel free to contact me, or I hope to meet you at our conference here next week in Lisbon, and we will go into all these issues in more detail. What I want to talk about today are several things. As Laurentina mentioned, I am not familiar with Portugal's framework of criminal justice and the legal system, but I will explain to you what we have to deal with here in America and to put this work that I'll be talking about into an American context. And you can see some of the challenges that we experience and how we are using this concept of the link to overcome the challenges in the American system of criminal justice and jurisprudence. And perhaps that can be applicable in a Portuguese context as well. What we are doing to address the challenges in prosecuting cases of animal cruelty is to emphasize how animal abuse is linked with interpersonal violence as well. And that is a message that is much stronger for legislators, for judges, for prosecutors in order to make progress. I'll describe 8 specific types of links between animal abuse and human violence, so you can see how these are all connected. I will offer some suggestions as to what judges and prosecutors can do with this information and implement these ideas in your courtrooms and in your other processes. And finally, I'm going to show you what is going on here in the US and around the world as various professions and communities respond to this new awareness of the link between animal abuse and human violence. First, let's look at how America works in its interpretation and prosecution of laws. Unlike a country like Portugal, or most European countries for that matter, we do not have a national law covering animal welfare. We are a collection of 50 states, and each state in the United States has its own set of laws. So each state is unique. There are very few federal laws that affect animal welfare. We have a few regarding transport of animals from overseas, from other countries, environmental regulations, and things like that. But when it comes to protecting individual animals from cruelty, it's all handled on the state level. And within that state, we have counties, and each county has a prosecutor. And there are over 3,100 county prosecutor agencies in the United States. And of course, each of those agencies has, a number of people in their staff. The county prosecutors are elected by their public, and so they are very susceptible to public pressure. And of course, in an urban area, their priorities might be different than in a rural area where there are agricultural interests that are, paying for the campaign funds of the prosecutors and emphasizing what they consider to be the best terms for animal welfare. So we have a wide range of different approaches. When a cruelty case is filed in a court, it may be a civil trial, in which case the prosecutor only has to show a preponderance of evidence. But in most cases, it's a criminal charge, in which case the threshold for proving guilt is much stronger. It has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. And so getting a conviction in any kind of a criminal charge, especially when there are 12 jurors and it has a unanimous verdict of all 12 jurors, getting a conviction is extremely difficult. If there are charges filed, it could be on possibly 3 levels. The usual cases are just very minor offenses where it's just a small fine, or it might be what we call a misdemeanor, in which case the person might get a fine and put in a local jail. A very serious charge would be a felony, in which case there is a much larger fine and the possibility of going to a state prison. However, most animal cruelty cases are very low priority because the public thinks it's only an animal, and they don't think this is as important as crimes against people. So these all result in a series of challenges which make it extremely difficult for animal welfare advocates and law enforcement agencies to pursue an animal cruelty case. The first challenge is that animals in the United States, as elsewhere, are considered property. They do not have rights. They have no legal standing. They cannot represent their own interests in a courtroom. And the laws have often, in every country, are based on the premise of hurting somebody's property, as opposed to representing that these animals might have interests of their own. In an animal cruelty case, it is difficult to establish the Latin concept of mens rea, which is the intent to harm the animal. It's a 2-step process. We have to be able to prove, first of all, that the animal was harmed, but then trying to prove that the perpetrator intended to harm the animal is a much more difficult threshold. And so that makes for a very big challenge for bringing charges against somebody. As I said before, prosecutors are elected officials, so they respond to public pressure. And of course, you have everything from a wide range of activists demanding more action to protect animals to agricultural and other animal interests saying we don't want any government regulation. Unlike crimes against people, animals can't testify about what happened. So it's up to a forensic investigator or witnesses or getting a confession to be able to identify exactly what the situation was to make sure that this was a deliberate act and not an accident. And those witnesses very often are afraid to speak up because they are afraid of the potential violence from the abuser. We now have a new field called veterinary forensics, taking the same techniques of crime scene investigation that has been used in human crime scenes for the longest time, and now applying that to animal cruelty cases. But that's a relatively new area, and not as many people are trained in that as are trained in the forensic work in cases of violence against humans. And frankly, most cases are unintentional neglect, as opposed to a deliberate act to harm the animal. And in a case where it's unintentional or where it's neglect, prosecution might not be the best solution. An educational intervention or a psychological intervention might actually be more appropriate in many cases. Another challenge is that there is no standard definition of cruelty to animals. Every state has its own definition. And what one person's moral beliefs are about this, what the community believes, what each profession believes, what the law says, can be completely different standards. What the witness says he saw, what the owner says actually happened, what a veterinarian investigating the animal decides, what a prosecutor or an investigator finds, and what the court finally determines, again, can be 6 completely different approaches to this. So there is no uniform definition, and it's up to each individual court case to pretty much determine, is this guilty or innocent? Believe it or not, there is not even a standard definition of the word animal. Every state has its own definition of animal, and there are many states in which certain species are excluded from the animal cruelty provisions. And I use an example of a duck, okay? And, we have an expression in America, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck and it looks like a duck, what is it? Well, of course it's a duck. But the fact is, if it's somebody's pet, it's treated by one set of laws. If it's a wild duck, it's treated by a different agency and a different set of laws. And if it's a commercial duck being raised for food, it may be treated by a third set of laws and standards. So it makes it extremely difficult to determine how to handle this particular case. And I'll give another example, which is the elephant. You're probably familiar with the Indian folktale about the 3 blind men looking at an elephant and seeing different parts of the elephant and trying to decide, what it is. Well, an elephant is a great example because it can be many different things. If this elephant is in a circus, it's actually private property. On the other hand, if it's a wild elephant roaming the savannas of East Africa, it's considered the king's property or the state's property. And wildlife is treated, going back to common English law and probably throughout the rest of Europe as well, as the king's property because no individual owns it. To the farmer whose crops are being trampled and eaten by that wild elephant, he considers this elephant a pest, a nuisance. And so European tourists will spend thousands of euros to go on safari to Africa to see the animals that the local people consider to be a pest. If this animal belongs to somebody, if this elephant actually belongs to a person and it's considered a peculiar form of property that can run away. And believe it or not, we have had cases of animal control officers picking up stray elephants in the United States. And there are lots of people in this country who have wild and exotic animals as pets. But this elephant could also be an endangered animal, an endangered species, needing a special form of protection from the law. If you use this elephant to attack somebody else and kill somebody, you can be charged with assault with a deadly weapon. And it's a little ridiculous to think this might happen with an elephant, but we see this with dog attacks where the person can be charged with assault with a deadly weapon. Some jurisdictions admit that the animal is property, but they call it sentient property, and they recognize that it has thoughts, it has feelings, it has interests. In some jurisdictions, the animal is entitled to a court advocate, a representative in the courtroom, in addition to the prosecutor, to represent the animal's interests in a cruelty case, because the animal can't be there to defend itself or talk about what happened. Some jurisdictions, and I believe Spain has enacted a law to this effect, define animals as members of the family. And in fact, emotionally, the overwhelming majority of Americans, and I suspect Portuguese people as well, consider their pets members of the family. And then, of course, there's the question as to whether these animals have rights, which in fact they do not. And I don't know of any country in the world in which animals are specifically granted the same rights that humans have. So that makes for a very confusing mess. And legislators have to wade through all that, and as a result, enacting laws that affect animal welfare becomes a unique field of a political struggle. And it's a conflict that emerges from so many different perspectives about whether pets are property or whether they are autonomous beings. And there are different norms about how to care for animals. The result of this is difficulty in enacting policies and implementing and enforcing laws that might improve the welfare of companion animals. Another challenge is that the animal welfare community, the animal shelters, the other agencies that are there to protect animals, have usually been marginalized by law enforcement, by prosecutors, by the courts, by the public, by legislators, by funders, because there's this widespread belief that animals are not as important as people. And one of the things we are seeing now in the United States and Canada is a beginning of a shift in that idea. The philosophy in the animal welfare community is switching to not just address animal problems, but also to address the human problems that underlie the crises affecting animals. The service philosophy in animal shelters is evolving to recognize that treating the symptoms of animal welfare problems, such as homeless animals or stray animals, animals that have been abused or neglected, that's only a stopgap solution. To be truly effective, the underlying causes, such as community dysfunction and family dysfunction and community violence, have to be addressed. And the link is bringing this all to the surface. How do we address these challenges? Very simple. In the absence of any community consensus as to what animal welfare means, what cruelty means, and in the absence of animals having legal standing in a court of law, the most pragmatic approach is to emphasize how animal abuse has an adverse impact on human health and human safety. And by emphasizing that the link between animal abuse and human violence, and emphasizing that animal abuse doesn't just hurt the animal, it also hurts people and it hurts society, prosecutors can make much more progress. Judges can do a much better job of protecting the public. Because the animals are considered property and because they're perceived as such, animal abuse traditionally has not been dealt with aggressively by law enforcement, prosecutors, or the courts. But given this growing acceptance of animals as part of the family unit and much data that has emerged in recent years. Animal abuse is now being looked at in a new light, and we are seeing it as a precursor to human violence. This is not new. This is actually a very ancient concept. I mean, philosophers since the time of St. Thomas Aquinas have been arguing that children who hurt animals often go on to become abusive adults. But within the legal system, it goes back a long way as well. As best as we can determine, the United States has the world's oldest laws protecting animals. They date to 1641, when we were not a country yet. We were still a collection of English colonies. And we had these laws now 380 years ago that protected animals, but they were based on the premise of you didn't want to hurt somebody else's property. And they were more designed to protect livestock and horses rather than companion dogs and cats. And the laws were enacted because it was believed it's not only wrong to hurt somebody else's property, but hurting an animal says something bad about the individual or the society. And in order to have a civil society, we need to include welfare of animals. So it's part of the morality of a community. So as far back as the 1600s, the premise behind animal cruelty laws has been not that the animals have rights, but how animal abuse has an impact on human well-being. And the first prosecutions we've been able to identify were only 8 years later in 1649 in one county in the colony of Massachusetts, in which in two separate cases, they weren't related, somebody was prosecuted and convicted for hurting a child and hurting an animal. So I think you can see that we need to take animal abuse more seriously than it's been treated in the past. First of all, it is a crime. A crime like any other crime, it has to be investigated and prosecuted and adjudicated like any other crime using the laws of criminal justice. It often indicates or predicts that there are other issues going on. Animal abuse rarely occurs in a vacuum. There may not only be other family violence involved, but there could be substance abuse, there could be marital problems, there could be financial distress, there could be homelessness, there could be mental health issues. There's almost always something else going on. We can no longer excuse it by saying, oh, boys will be boys, or it's only an animal. Sorry, that doesn't work anymore. We know that children harming animals, it can be an extremely dangerous situation. It's one of the earliest indicators of conduct disorder. And it starts showing up at about the age of 6.5. And if we don't treat it early, probably not through prosecution, but through counseling and psychological intervention and parental guidance, that animal abuse can escalate to more severe crimes and crimes against people. We really see the link demonstrated in situations of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And what we know from the research is that domestic violence abusers who also have histories of pet abuse are much more likely to have had other violent incidents. We have research that shows that 80% of victims of domestic violence, and these victims are usually women, the abusers are usually men. Doesn't always happen that way. We have men who abuse women, and we have intimate partner violence in same-sex relationships. But it's usually a man abusing a woman. But what we find is that when there's domestic violence and animal abuse, at least 80% of these women had at least one prior domestic violence incident, and often as many as 50 prior incidents before they were courageous enough to call for help. And they don't call for help and they don't leave because they are afraid of what will happen to their animals by the abuser if they were to leave. The violence in a domestic violence situation, when animal abuse is also present, the violence is much more serious. It's much more hands-on. 76% of these women had been strangled. And we all know how significant strangulation is in a domestic violence situation. 26% had been forced to have sex with a man. 80% of them feared for their lives. They were afraid that they would be killed by the guy. Law enforcement officers always tell us that the cases they fear the most are domestic violence situations because there's an extremely high risk of them dying when they go into a domestic violence situation. It turns out that when there's animal abuse as well as the domestic violence, that risk to law enforcement of the risk of dying doubles. The link shows that animal abuse is often linked with other crimes. This was a study from the city of Chicago looking at people who had been convicted of animal cruelty. And you can see that significant numbers of them were members of gangs. They had been arrested on sex crimes. They had charges filed against them for illegal weapons or for battery, for narcotics. They'd had multiple arrests and many felony level charges filed against them. Another study in Chicago found that in some neighborhoods, as many as 31% of teenagers had been to a dog fight where they saw animals fighting to the death and were subjected to the narcotics trafficking, the sex trafficking, the gambling, the guns, and the other offenses that go along with dogfighting. This is not just an American phenomenon. We have research on this from around the world. This is a study from Australia. It's done by a police department in Sydney, Australia. And they found that a history of animal abuse was a better predictor of sexual assault than were prior convictions for homicide, arson, or firearms offenses. They found that 99% of people who'd been convicted of animal cruelty had committed other crimes, and they averaged 4 other crimes. And they wrote that law enforcement's knowing about animal cruelty cases would be a great benefit when they're profiling suspects for homicide, sexual assault, stalking, and child abuse cases. I'll give you a couple of case examples, a couple of case studies to show how this plays out in real life. This was a situation from a county just north of Philadelphia in the state of Pennsylvania. It was a bitterly cold night in January, and the neighbors were concerned about the welfare of a dog in that doghouse there in the backyard in a snowy field. It was a homemade doghouse. And the neighbors called the police. The police came, they called the local animal protection agency. It's called a Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, an SPCA. And they took the dog away. The police went into the house and found a dead 4-year-old boy who had been beaten to death because he accidentally looked at somebody while they were going to the bathroom. The resident of the house was a pastor, and he and his wife had 3 of their own children and 4 children in foster care that they were caring for. They fled from Pennsylvania. They went to Atlanta in the state of Georgia. They were eventually apprehended, extradited back to Pennsylvania. They went to court, and he was convicted of felony child abuse and homicide and was sentenced to 22 years in prison. There are two other factors to the story that are relevant to this. The first is that because animal abuse often occurs outdoors, and because the neighbors are concerned, and because the neighbors know the dog can't pick up the phone and dial for help, animal abuse may be the first indication that a law enforcement or social service agency needs to investigate a situation. So the animal welfare investigators can be the first responders to and uncover other situations that are going on. The second point of this case is that 4 years prior to this man had been convicted of domestic violence. And 4 years before that, he had been convicted of animal cruelty. And all these agencies in this county in Pennsylvania were not talking to each other. They were in their silos, and they were working independently and didn't realize what they had in front of them. Here's another case. This was also from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. As the woman explained to the judge, she was thinking of her dogs when she pulled the trigger. For 13 years, her husband had battered her, but one night he not only whipped her with a vacuum cleaner cord, he also punched one of her 4 German shepherds and warned her that if she left, he would find her and slit the dog's throat in front of her. Later that night, as her husband slept, she loaded a pistol and pointed it at herself. A moment away from suicide, she saw her oldest female dog and said, "Duchess, if I die, what's going to happen to you?" And so instead, she went into her husband's bedroom and shot him. And she got 10 to 20 years in prison for murder. This shows how the animals are soft targets, and they are used as a point of vulnerability by an abuser to trap domestic violence victims in their homes, in a toxic relationship, in an abusive situation, and it gets extremely emotional as a result. So we can see that animal abuse is really the tip of the iceberg. And very often there's child abuse and neglect, elder abuse, or domestic violence under the surface. The link can occur across the lifespan. It affects children, it affects adults, and affects senior citizens. And that animal abuse can precede the other crime, it can follow the other crime, or they can occur at the same time. But if we recognize animal abuse as an indicator that something is wrong in that home, this can be the first step in stopping the cycle of violence and creating safer communities. It's what we call the dark side of the human-animal bond. The human-animal bond refers to those wonderful emotional attachments that so many of us have towards our pets. And those of you who have pets know what I'm talking about. You just get this gratification, and you get that wagging tail and the licking of your face, and it's just, you've got a new friend there and everything is wonderful. But there's this dark side of the bond. It's the animal abuse. And what we say is very simple. When animals are abused, people are at risk. And when people are abused, animals are at risk. So a key point for all this: criminal justice, judges, law enforcement officials, prosecutors, anybody within this system who understands the link between crimes against animals and crimes against people, and the intense emotional bonds that women and children in particular have for their pets. If we understand all that, we're in a much better position to prevent future violence and protect the community. So we can make more progress protecting people and pets by recognizing the link. Animal cruelty is a crime, and it's a crime of violence. Even though the law treats it as a crime against property, it is a crime of violence, and it's not just the animal that becomes the victim. We can prevent other forms of family violence and stop the cycles of violence by recognizing animal abuse as a potential indicator and a potential predictor of other crimes. And I emphasize potential. It does not mean that every little boy who kicks the cat is going to grow up to become a serial killer, but he could. And very often, the animal abuse indicates or predicts other crimes. If we hold animal abusers accountable, we not only prevent other crimes, but we express solidarity as a profession that this is just not acceptable activity. And we change the community's attitudes towards violence and safety. We say in English that a dog is man's best friend. Measures to prevent, to prosecute, and punish animal cruelty certainly benefit man's best friend, but they also benefit man. And they really benefit women. The link connects the dots. Like I said, these 4 forms of family violence operate on their own in silos. And of the 4 forms of family violence, animal cruelty has always been pushed to the margin. It's always been pushed outside by law enforcement, by the courts, by human services agencies, by legislators, because they don't think animals are important as people. And it wasn't even until the early 1990s that the 3 forms of human violence began talking to each other. The first national conference on the impact of domestic violence on children wasn't held until 1992. Well, it didn't occur to people that children are affected by the parents when the parents are fighting. And at the same time, people began to realize that domestic violence doesn't just affect young couples, it affects older people as well. But again, the animal cruelty aspect was ignored. That now changes. And this is the model we use for the link. It shows that these 4 forms of family violence overlap. And anybody working in any one of those fields can see some of the other forms of family violence. And prosecutors, judges, law enforcement, veterinarians, social service agencies, social workers, they can be right there in the middle and see as many as 4 forms of family violence. So to deal with all this, we created the National Link Coalition back in 2008. And we work in 4 major areas. We look at programs that are addressing this in the United States and around the world. We look at legislation. We conduct training programs like this to raise public and professional awareness. And then we keep track of academic research, and we now have some 2,100 citations in our bibliography legitimizing all this. We publish a free monthly newsletter. It's called the Link Letter. We have 5,100 people who read it every month in 55 countries, as well as all across the US. We try to organize other coalitions to work together to achieve the same results. And we have coalitions across the United States on the local level and national coalitions in Canada, the UK, Spain, Italy, and Sweden. And I hope one of the things that comes out of all the work that Laurentina is doing will be to create a link coalition in Portugal as well. There are 8 types of links that we've identified. The most prevalent is this domestic violence connection. It's about him exercising power and control. And to do that, he will exploit any weakness he can find, and her emotional attachment and care for the animals and fear for what would happen to the animals if she leaves becomes a very valuable weapon for him. And consequently, they don't leave. The women and the children stay. He warns them, I killed your cat, I can kill you too. You could be next. It's a form of emotional extortion. We have a similar situation with child sexual abuse, where the abuser warns the little boy or the little girl that if they talk about what happens, he'll kill her puppy or his puppy. And so now the child is dealing with multiple issues of physical trauma, emotional trauma, confusion about how to relate to this person, anxiety and fear, and now also has to worry about protecting his pet or her pet. That should never happen to a child. We have a condition called adverse childhood experiences. This was a term that was created by a study by our federal Centers for Disease Control a number of years ago, describing the traumatic effects or the effects of trauma on children, their adverse experiences when they were children. And what they found was that children who are subjected to trauma in their early years not only have lifelong emotional issues, but they also adopt risky health behaviors, which leads to worse health and even earlier death. They did not include a child's committing acts of animal cruelty or even witnessing acts of animal cruelty as one of those adverse childhood experiences because they ignored it because it was only an animal. But as I said earlier, it's a very dangerous situation, and a child who hurts or kills or tortures animals by about the age of 6.5 is on the road to some form of conduct disorder. We have the problem of bullying. Youths who bully other youths are more aggressive, and they are also more aggressive towards animals. But interestingly enough, it's also the children who have been bullied are more aggressive towards animals as well. They take that bullying behavior that's been directed at them, and they have to gain some control somehow, and so they target animals. We have the issue of animal hoarding, which is huge. Tremendous numbers of animals are affected by this. I'll talk more about this shortly. It can affect any age group, but it is usually older, isolated women. And so it can be very closely linked with elder abuse issues and other issues affecting seniors. We have dog fighting and cockfighting, which are now illegal in all 50 states. And that's largely because it's been linked with homicides, sex trafficking, narcotics, weapons, racketeering, and other crimes. We had a case in Hawaii last month in which there was a cockfight and 2 rival gangs were involved. Gunfire broke out, 2 people were killed, and 21 people were injured. The school shooters and the mass shooters, and I hope Portugal has not experienced this to the horrible degree that the United States has. And I'm sure you've read about all these cases in the media. What we find is that about 10% of these mass shooters have histories of animal cruelty. And then the last area of the link is animal sexual abuse. There are people who prefer to have sex with animals. However, it is illegal in 49 states now, and that is a major change as a result of link research documenting that people who have sex with animals often are pedophiles and are guilty of child sex abuse and child pornography as well. As I said, the animals are soft targets, and an easy way for an abuser in a domestic violence situation to exercise his power and control. We know that pets are found most frequently in homes with children. In the US, more than 2/3 of homes with children under age 6 and almost 3/4 of homes with children over age 6 have pets. I don't know what Portugal's statistics are, but I suspect they're similar. And who cares for these pets? It's always the woman in the house, almost always the woman in the household. 80% of these homes, the woman cares for the pets. So this becomes a point of vulnerability that the abuser will exploit. How we view animals has changed dramatically, even though the law hasn't, and that creates a huge disconnect. In the United States, 99% of us think of animals as members of the family or close companions. Only 1% think of their pets as property. And I suspect in Portugal, the numbers would be similar. But that creates a problem because animals are legally considered property. They are in the same category as a toaster. But no battered woman ever ran back to her toaster to rescue it in a domestic violence situation. But they don't leave, or they will go back into a domestic violence home to rescue their pets. This link approach is much more effective when talking to legislators on any level. Dogs and cats don't vote. And so legislators have traditionally just ignored animal welfare issues. The fact is, though, their owners do vote. And there are a lot of people in both countries who own pets and who care about them. So for legislators, animal welfare issues have often been a lose-lose situation because an issue comes up and you get all these different philosophies as to how to handle the animal welfare issue, and legislators just don't want to have to deal with that. But we can make it a win-win situation by recognizing that hurting animals hurts people. The mayor of the city of Baltimore a number of years ago created an animal cruelty task force. And we're seeing more of these task forces in the United States all the time. And what she said was that animal cruelty is more than just a legal issue. It's a community issue. If you improve animal welfare, you improve public safety for everyone. And that's a message that legislators understand, improving public safety. It's often been said that animal abuse always leads to human violence, that people who torture animals get desensitized to violence and then move on to hurting people. That's not necessarily true. A study that was done a number of years ago looked at 153 people who had been prosecuted for animal cruelty, and they looked at their criminal records for 10 years before and 10 years afterwards to see if they had any other crimes. And they matched this group of people with a control group that had not abused animals. And they expected to find two things. They thought they were going to find the animal abusers were more likely to have other criminal records, and that the animal abuse came first, and then they had these other crimes. Well, the first part of that was true. 70% of the animal abusers had committed other crimes. The control group, it was only 22%. So we can say that animal abusers are much more likely to have other crimes. But surprisingly, in most cases, the other crime came first. It preceded the animal cruelty case. And so there are two ways to look at this. It can be the escalation hypothesis or the graduation hypothesis, where they start out hurting animals and they escalate into hurting people. But more likely than not, it's a pattern of general deviance. It's part of a whole constellation of antisocial behaviors, just one part of a larger picture of sociopathic behavior. So we know that animal abuse doesn't always lead to human violence, but it often does. And we shouldn't be surprised when we find this link. It's often been said that children who hurt animals grow up to become serial killers. And that's not quite true. It's a gross oversimplification. Not all childhood abusers grow up to become psychopaths. And in fact, many children who are surrounded by violence seek comfort in their animals and try to protect them. I don't know what Portugal's laws are defining animal cruelty, but I'll tell you how we deal with this in the United States. Like I said, every state has its own definition. As a result of this link interest, our Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, finally got involved because we have no national data in terms of how many animal cruelty cases there are, because it's all handled on a local level and no agency is coordinating all this. Well, because of this link interest, the FBI started working on this area. And they came up with a very simple definition of 4 types of animal cruelty. And it's an interesting way just to think of all this. Most cases are simple neglect, an animal that's just neglected and doesn't have adequate food or water or shelter. Often the person, abandons the animal, or they just don't have the money to provide proper care, or they don't know what the animal needs. When we get into animal hoarding, where it's neglect on a huge scale, this is called gross neglect. Then we have physical abuse of animals. That's trauma, beating, bruising, torturing the animal, stabbing it, kicking it, etc. Organized abuse is animal fighting, dog fighting and cockfighting. And then animal sexual abuse, which, as I said, is very strongly linked with child sexual abuse and child pornography. Okay, what are we doing here? Oh, my computer has froze up on me for some reason. Oh, this is embarrassing.
No worries.
Yeah. Hang on a second here. Can I stop the share?
Não tem problema. Ele pode tomar o tempo que ele precisar, não é? Sem stress.
Where are we doing this? Okay. I am
Peço desculpa, será possível o Dr. Phil sair e voltar a entrar para colocar a apresentação?
Sim, estamos só a aguardar que o Dr. Phil volte a entrar na sala.
Pois, acho que é o melhor, foi a indicação que eu lhe dei. Pedimos desculpa, acontece. Peço desculpa, vamos aguardar uns minutos para o Dr. Phil, que está na Flórida, poder reiniciar e voltar a entrar com o link de Palestrante. Aproveitamos para fazer, se calhar, aqui uma pequena pausa, mas penso para não saírem e esperar que o Phil consiga resolver o assunto que está a ter com o computador dele. Esperamos que seja uma quebra de ligação breve.
E eu aproveito para cumprimentar, que há pouco não consegui estar no início. Não sei se me estão a ouvir. Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Muito obrigado.
Boa tarde, a ouvir bastante
Viva.
bem.
Obrigado.
Viva.
Can you hear me now?
Perfectly.
Sim, sim.
Okay, let me see if I can share my screen again. I apologize for that. Had to reboot here. Okay. Okay. All right, let's try this again here. Okay. Ah. Wonders of technology and the challenges of technology. Okay. Why are people cruel to animals? Well, the short answer is that there are as many reasons for animal cruelty as there are for interpersonal violence. And it's not a case of one size fits all. Every case is different. Many times the people are just ignorant and just don't know how to properly care for animals, or they just don't empathize with animals and they don't realize that animals have feelings. They feel entitled to harm them because they don't think animals are worthy of moral consideration. They may come from a culture where abuse is normal. They're socialized to physical violence, and they will just take off. They will exert violence and control over any victim, whether it has 2 legs or 4 legs. It's all about power and control. They may be under pressure from other issues going on, and so their coping skills are limited. They're highly sensitive to stress and strain, and something that the animal does releases their frustration and anger, and they take that anger out against the animal. They have poor impulse control or some kind of a personality dysfunction. As we've said, they may harm animals as a way to intimidate or threaten or control somebody else. It's not just in domestic violence or child sexual abuse. Often they have an argument with a neighbor, and rather than talking to the neighbor to try to resolve the issue, they'll take hamburger and poison it and throw it over the fence and poison the neighbor's dog. Many times they just use inappropriate physical force to try to control the animal, and that doesn't work. And it's the same thing as with child abuse. At what point does spanking become physical child abuse? There's a threshold there at some point, and we see the same thing with disciplining animals. And then we have people who are psychopaths. They get sadistic pleasure or sexual gratification from harming animals, and it's a way to enhance their own sense of aggressiveness. Why are children cruel to animals? For all those same reasons, plus more. They may just not know any better. It could be just curiosity. They may be under pressure from a gang member to torture an animal as an initiation to join the gang. We have situations where teenagers who are bored torture animals, and they video the torture and then watch those videos later when they get depressed. We have animal cruelty occur when somebody's afraid of the animal and they retaliate against it. Or they will try to protect the animal from even worse abuse. We've had cases of children smothering their pets to keep them from being physically abused by the person who's abusing everybody else in the home. Or the child will harm an animal to reenact his own experience of having been abused or to regain a sense of power after being abused. The children may imitate what they see the adults in their lives doing. And in worst case scenario, it's a dress rehearsal for interpersonal violence. And we see this with serial killers, like, for example, Nicholas Cruz up there. He was the shooter in the Parkland, Florida school shooting a number of years ago. Let's look at how some of these links came to be. The oldest area of the link is the connection between animal abuse and child abuse. And as I mentioned, philosophers have been talking about this for hundreds of years. Interestingly enough, the first child abuse cases in the United States, and I think in any other country, were handled by animal protection agencies. In the US, we call them humane societies, or SPCAs, Societies for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And this got started in 1874. Henry Berg was the American ambassador to Russia. He was coming back to the US and he stopped off in London where he saw the Royal SPCA. We didn't have anything like that in the US, so he created the American SPCA, the ASPCA. And 8 years later, he was asked to intervene on behalf of a little girl named Mary Ellen, who was being abused. And Berg thought that children should be entitled to at least the same amount of protection as a horse. We did have laws at the time protecting horses, but there were no laws protecting children. So he formed the first National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children and was instrumental in getting many animal welfare organizations to have a dual function of protecting both animals and children. And many animal welfare organizations had that dual function until 1971, when a federal law was passed creating our National Child Protection Agency and state and county child protection agencies under that umbrella. Humane societies went back to just protecting animals, but the link is bringing that back full circle. There is good research on this. One of the earliest studies on this was highly significant, looking at families that had been investigated for child abuse and neglect by the Child Welfare Agency. 60% of them also had abused or neglected pets. And in cases where it was physical child abuse, the rate of animal abuse was 88%. That is a tremendous overlap, a tremendous risk factor. Two other things came out of this study. There were 11 times more dog bites in these homes where there was both child abuse and animal abuse co-occurring. The animals fought back the only way they could, with their teeth. And so in addition to the child abuse, we now have a threat of rabies, we have physical trauma, we have a public health risk, as well as animal abuse and child abuse. The study also found that these homes where there was child abuse and animal abuse saw veterinarians at pretty much the same rate as homes where there was no child abuse going on. So when veterinarians tell us that they won't see abused children, that's not true, they will. And so we're training veterinarians as well to recognize not only animal abuse, but also child abuse and domestic violence and elder abuse. I mentioned the ACEs study, these adverse childhood experiences, earlier. These adverse experiences harm a child's developing brain architecture, which makes them hypersensitive to perceived threats and to adopt risky behaviors and leads to lifelong physical and mental health issues. But unfortunately, they did not include exposure to animal cruelty as one of these adverse experiences. That was a tremendous gap in the system. The domestic violence link with animal abuse is much more prevalent. We have, as I said, we have women, thousands of them, who don't leave home or return home for fear of what will happen to their pets. I had one case of this. I was sitting at my desk and a woman called me from the parking lot of a domestic violence shelter 1,500 miles away, saying that they wouldn't let her in. She had finally worked up the courage to escape, but they wouldn't let her into the shelter because she had a dog and they wouldn't take the dog. And she said, "I've loved this dog longer than any relationship I've ever had." That's how intense this human animal bond is. I was able to direct her to a domestic violence shelter that accepts pets. And today we have more than 300 pet-friendly women's shelters in the United States. The abusers target the pets to get revenge against her or the family or friends who help her escape. It's a way to coerce and control them. He holds the family hostage. And a study in New Zealand looked at this and found out that the abusers will brag about harming the animals because they think it makes them sound more powerful. They don't realize they are admitting to a crime. And they target the animals because they can, because they think they can get away with it because the police don't care, because the animals are convenient, and they do it, frankly, because it works. It's a very effective technique. A more recent study, we do have a national domestic violence crisis line, a telephone hotline. And this study was the first to ask questions of people who were calling the hotline. We have a lot of studies of women who are already in shelter, but this was the first study to look at people calling the hotline. They talked to 2,500 of them. And you can see the numbers there. 97% of these women calling for help said keeping their pets with them was important in deciding whether or not they would seek safety. And half of them would not leave if they couldn't take their pets. Almost half of them were afraid that the abuser would harm or kill the pets. 30% said the children had witnessed the abuse. And almost 3/4 of them were not aware that there are, in fact, pet-friendly shelters now. And we're trying to establish them in other countries as well. One study of women in shelters said that 71% of them reported their husband or boyfriend had killed, harmed, or threatened the animal. The study also found that almost 1/3 of these women said their children had hurt or killed the animals. And this is what we call the intergenerational cycle of violence. Another study tried to identify what are the 4 biggest risk factors for somebody becoming a domestic violence abuser. And they found 4. The first 3 didn't surprise them. These men have mental health issues. They're often substance abusers, and they have low levels of education. But the 4th factor that they weren't counting on, that was a real surprise, was this history of actual or threatened animal abuse. It's one of the 4 greatest risk factors for somebody becoming a domestic violence abuser. This is what the intergenerational cycle of violence looks like. The abuser harms or threatens the animals. The survivors stay. The children are exposed to this, and they grow up to become violent or victims themselves, and they repeat the whole cycle all over again. So animal abuse should be considered a wake-up call. There are many reasons why a domestic violence victim doesn't leave. There are financial reasons, emotional reasons. What is she going to do with the children? Where is she going to go? He controls the money. She may not have transportation. And they will blame themselves. They will blame the animal. They'll say it was my fault, or he didn't mean to do it, or he's really getting better. And what we need to be telling these women is that if he's hurting harmless animals, it's not your fault. It's not the dog's fault. It's his fault. And you need to make a safety plan to get you and your children and the pets out of this environment. The newest area of the link is this connection with elder abuse. People who are working with older people are often dealing with people with very typical situations. They may have memory loss from Alzheimer's or dementia. They may be on low income. They may have physical health issues that keep them from being fully active. They may have limited transportation. They may be socially isolated. And these factors conspire to create several situations that affect their animals as well. They may have pets that they love dearly, but because of those situations, they wind up neglecting them and the animals are neglected. Or we see cases of self-neglect, where they will take what limited money they have and spend it on their animals instead of themselves. So their animals may be happy and healthy, but the seniors are undernourished. Or they may not go into a hospital or a nursing home because there's nobody there to care for their pet. They may be extremely attached to this pet. This pet may be the only reason she has to get up in the morning with a sense of purpose to clean the litter box. Or maybe the only reason he has to go out of the house and take the dog for a walk and meet some other people. And when that animal dies, it can be extremely devastating to this person. And that person can literally lose the will to live. And we have situations where people who are considering suicide take all their pets into a veterinarian and ask to have them euthanized so they can clear up all their affairs and commit suicide. We have safety issues of home health aides or family service agencies who don't go into a home where there is an older person in needing of care because the house is filthy. There may be rats and mice because the dog food cans have piled up in the sink for months at a time, or their litter box hasn't been changed in many weeks. We have this power and control situation where children will hold their elderly parents' pets hostage for ransom money. We have issues involving service animals, guide dogs, and similar types of service animals, where one partner is jealous of the other partner's extreme dependence on the service animal. And then animal hoarding, which, as I said, can affect any age group, but it tends to be older people. And it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle of isolation. These people don't like other people. They're afraid of other people. And so they surround themselves with the positive effects of the human-animal bond, and they carry it to an extreme. They wind up with too many animals. Because they have so many animals, nobody else wants to have anything to do with them. And so the cycle just keeps repeating itself. Some people who have difficulty establishing supportive interpersonal relationships or who have difficulty coping with the stresses of life find their safety in animals. We've identified 4 types of animal hoarders. Some of them are mentally ill, and a wide range of mental disorders have been associated with animal hoarding, but we think it's an attachment disorder stemming from early childhood trauma, and they're unable to get close to other people, so they surround themselves with friendly animals. Some of them become overwhelmed. These are what we call the crazy cat ladies. Everybody brings their unwanted dogs or cats to them rather than take them to the animal shelter. And so there are suddenly 60 cats running around your neighborhood. We have the rescuers. Excuse me. They will collect animals, specific breeds. They will steal other people's animals because they believe they're the only ones who can provide proper care. And then there are exploiters. They pose as an animal welfare agency. In fact, they are hoarders, and they all keep their animals in deplorable conditions, houses that are overloaded with filth and feces and urine and overcrowding, and the animals suffer as a result. What can judges and prosecutors do with all this information? Here are several ideas. Well, first, be familiar with the animal law, with the laws affecting animal cruelty, abuse, and neglect. In any court proceeding, and particularly in family court cases, such as child custody, child foster care, a divorce proceeding, issuing a protective order, ask if any of the people have strong bonds with their animals that should be preserved. For example, should a child going into foster care be able to take their pet with them? Should a child go into foster care where there are pets? Should a child who's an animal abuser go into a home where there are pets? If there's a divorce, who's going to get custody of those animals? Which party is best prepared to care for it? What's going to be best in the animal's interests? If there's a protection order, protecting a domestic violence victim from further abuse, include the animals in that protection order. When investigating or prosecuting animal cruelty cases, always be on the lookout for other possible crimes. And similarly, if you're handling a domestic violence or child abuse or elder abuse case, be on the lookout for possible animal abuse. We recommend these 3 questions in any kind of a family law case. They're very open-ended questions, and people love to talk about their pets. They're fearful of talking about their own situation. The defenses go up. They're afraid of the system. They're afraid of the law enforcement officers. But when you ask people about their pets, they open up. They love to talk about them. So try asking these 3 questions. Are there any pets or farm animals that are involved in this? Are there any animals at home? Are you concerned with their well-being? Has anybody in your family ever threatened, harmed, or killed an animal? Asking those 3 questions can open up a window into what else is going on in the household. And it's a mirror of the interpersonal relationships. The way people interact with their animals reflects the way they interact with each other. And so these 3 questions are an excellent way to find out more about what is happening above and beyond the particular immediate circumstances that you're investigating. So ask, are there animals at home? Are you concerned about their well-being? And has anybody ever harmed, threatened, or killed them? We're encouraging judges and prosecutors to become familiar with the basic common signs of animal abuse and neglect. The law statutes may be very complex, but this is really common sense as much as anything else. So it's just failure to have regular veterinary care, inadequate food, water, or shelter, extreme overcrowding, too many animals, a hoarding situation, animals that are infested with parasites, with fleas and ticks and other insects, animals that haven't been groomed. I have been in animal shelters where a dog came in that was so matted with fur, you could not tell which end of the dog was the front and which end was the back. Animals being housed in unsanitary conditions. And we have information on our website. This is an example of one of them. It was a card created by the Child Protection Agency, Child and Family Protection Agency in the state of Connecticut, to tell them what to look for and how to report animal abuse. And there's a similar card for animal welfare investigators telling them what the telltale signs are of child abuse. There are many legal tools that courts can use to protect animals. Filing charges, of course, for animal cruelty, abuse, or neglect, including animals in domestic violence orders of protection is a big step forward. Awarding custody of animals in divorce settlements based on what are the animal's best interests. I have been in animal shelters where one party brought the animals in to put them up for adoption, so his wife wouldn't get the animals in the divorce case. We are trying to get more and more domestic violence shelters, women's shelters, to accept pets, and courts can play a major role in making that happen. Similarly, when people are evicted, they often have animals with them, and protections need to be available to keep that animal with that person. And we have growing evidence about the emotional importance of animals for homeless people who are living on the street. Veterinarians need to be trained in all this. And we're training veterinarians to provide the clinical evidence that will help you as prosecutors and judges to get the accurate information about what happened to the animal to help you make a better determination as to whether this was accidental or non-accidental injury, and to train veterinarians how to provide the expert witness testimony. And we are seeing an interest in appointing special advocates to represent the interests of animals and the interests of justice in cruelty cases when they go to court. The National District Attorneys Association in the US, one of our two national agencies, national organizations representing prosecutors, created some excellent material on this. Two of my colleagues wrote this 10 years ago now. It's also on our website. They recommend treating an animal abuse case like an assault. It's not a crime against property. It is an assault. It's a crime of violence. And in fact, the FBI considers animal cruelty a crime against property. Animal shelters and veterinarians may not be familiar with the legal procedures of what's necessary in executing a search warrant, or how to rescue an animal under emergency circumstances, how to preserve evidence for possible prosecution. And so the legal profession can do a great service by training the animal people on what they need to do to be able to prosecute a case more effectively. And we are training more and more veterinarians in the art of forensic. We have a program at the University of Florida that is an online course, and we have veterinary forensics people from around the world. Tremendous interest in this in Brazil, by the way, speaking of other Portuguese language countries. And so we're getting more veterinary forensics specialists trained, again, to give you the information that you need to prosecute a case. When there is an animal cruelty case, particularly if there are large numbers of animals involved, what are you going to do with them? There may be too many animals for any one place to handle. And so they may have to find a number of shelters who can care for them. The animals may have to be held as evidence. They may have to be impounded on the owner's premises. May have to get the owner to surrender the animals to the agency. Many times the animals have to be euthanized, and then a necropsy has to be performed. And the costs of these can be enormous, and courts can impose a bond on the person to make them pay for what can be hundreds of thousands of dollars or euros to care for these animals for what may be a very lengthy period of time until the case comes to court. Always be on the lookout for possible link connections. Talk to the children. The children in particular love to talk about their animals. Asking them about their pets is a great way to gain their confidence, to build rapport with them, and to find out more about what's happening in the home. We are seeing many prosecutors and law enforcement agencies setting up specialized animal abuse units because the public is demanding action and because these cases are very complex and they require somebody with additional training. And right now we have about 56 of these animal abuse units in prosecutors' offices and law enforcement offices around the US. I mentioned including pets in domestic violence protection orders. This movement got started in 2006 in the state of Maine, which is up here in the extreme northeast corner of the US, with one woman testifying before the state legislature that it wasn't just the dogs and cats that had been harmed, but it was the farm animals as well. He had killed them before. He wouldn't hesitate to do it again. She was afraid for their welfare and she couldn't leave the farm. That state passed the world's first law specifically allowing courts to include animals in protection from abuse orders. And today we now have 38 of our 50 states with similar laws. And we also have a federal law. It's called the Pet and Women's Safety Act, which allows these pet protection orders to be enforced from one state to another state. And it's also making $3 million a year available to women's shelters to help them build facilities to care for the animals of domestic violence victims. I'd like to call these programs witness protection programs for pets, just to try to lighten the mood a little bit, because it's a very heavy topic. We have some 600 women's shelters that don't have facilities to care for the pets themselves, but have an arrangement for foster care with other animal agencies in the community. And we have some 300 of these shelters in the US that now accept pets, and more in several other countries. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK just got its first one, the Netherlands. We'll be talking about this at the conference on June the 2nd with a couple of speakers talking about how to do this. Also, there is a webinar next Monday with Katie Campbell from a group called Red Rover here in the US, talking about the mechanics of how to make pet-friendly shelters. Great program is called Sheltering Animals and Families Together, the safetyprogram.org, with resources to help women's shelters do this. And Allie Phillips, who developed this program, she will be at our conference next week. We have 7 of our states now in which courts can award custody of an animal in a divorce settlement based on what the court decides is the animal's best interest. And that is a major step forward in all this, similar to awarding child custody in the child's best interests. In 11 of our states, an act of animal abuse in a domestic violence situation or a dating violence situation can be prosecuted not only as an act of animal cruelty, but also as an act of domestic violence. I mentioned bestiality or animal sexual abuse. It's now illegal in 49 of our states. 38 of these states have just come on board just within the last 20 years because of this recognition of animal abuse with animal sexual abuse with child sexual abuse and other sexual offenses. And you can see the numbers here of the number of animal sex offenders who had offended, sexually offended children or adults, who had records of child pornography and a wide range of sexual fetishes, or using children to have sex with animals to groom them for future sex abuse. It's a very serious problem. We have provisions in many states where people convicted of illegal sexual acts go onto a sex offender registry. And neighbors have to be notified when there is a sex offender living in their neighborhood. In 22 of our states, somebody committed of having sex with animals has to be a registered sex offender. Veterinarians are now getting involved with this, and this has been a long struggle. Our attitude is that physicians since the 1960s have been mandated by law to report suspected child abuse. And we think veterinarians should be at least as active in reporting suspected animal abuse as pediatricians are in reporting suspected child abuse. We now have laws in 41 of our states that either require veterinarians to report animal abuse, those are the states in blue, or permit them to report, those are the states in green. And in 34 of those states, the ones with the check marks, they have immunity from lawsuits for making a report in good faith. Veterinarians have been afraid of violating confidentiality or being sued for making a wrong report, and they have protections that are enabling them and requiring them to make these reports. And we will be talking more about that issue as well at the conference next week. We have a new advocate in the courtroom, therapy dogs that are working with children in child sexual abuse cases to help ease their fears of confronting their abuser and being re-victimized and traumatized again when they have to face their abuser in a courtroom. And we're training therapy dogs and their handlers to work in the courtroom. We now have some 300 places in the United States where these therapy dogs, or courtroom dogs as we call them, are working with prosecutors or in courtrooms to help children who are victims of sexual abuse. So in summary, and I want to leave some time for questions and answers here. Animal abuse not only hurts animals, it hurts people. It is a form of family violence. It's not on the outside. It's part of the family violence framework. If we recognize it and respond to it, it enforces the law, it helps our families, it helps our communities, it saves lives. Focusing on the link in family violence cases sends a powerful message to the community and to the voters that you care about animals as well as people. It inspires law enforcement to treat animal welfare cases more seriously when they see the judges and prosecutors are handing down stiff sentences. Law enforcement recognizes that they need to pay attention to this. And again, it creates safer communities and prevents future violence. Animal abuse is the abused canary in the coal mine. A forensic veterinarian here in the US said, the canary in the coal mine of an abusive home may literally be an abused canary. But by responding to that injury or death of that canary, we can potentially save many other pets and people. We have lots of resources available for you. If you go to our website, nationallinkcoalition.org, and look in our resources section, we have it broken out by professions. And so there's a section there for prosecutors and for judges. Some of the things we have there, let me go forward one slide here first. Well, okay, I'll get to that. There's a group called the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. Jot this down, ncjfcj.org. And they have a whole section of their work dedicated to animal cruelty cases for judges, and tremendous resources there. This cover here is from a technical assistance bulletin that they published, and they have other resources there, bench cards for judges and other materials. It's a great resource for judges. I mentioned Allie Phillips. She created the safety program. She will be at our conference next week. She's written extensively about this. This is a guidebook for criminal justice professionals. The National Sheriff's Association, one of our major law enforcement organizations in the US, has great materials on this. There's a special issue that they published in their magazine. We also have the the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. That's APA.org. I'm sorry, APAINC.org. I think I have a slide coming up with these addresses, with great resources as well. And again, we have this free monthly newsletter.